1975 through 1978. Furthermore, we made it crystal clear that the record of atrocities was gruesome, perhaps even at the level of the most outlandish fabrications. Note that Shawcross could have cited real examples of skepticism. For example, the skepticism of State Department analysts at the height of the furor over Cambodia, or the retrospective comments of Douglas Pike and others cited earlier, or the comments of journalists during Phase 2 who were willing to conclude only that refugee accounts suggest that the Khmer Rouge is finding it hard to govern the country except by coercion, and even suggest that terror is being employed as a system of government, noting that refugees did not appear to be in a sorry condition, and that if the Khmer Rouge are perpetrating an atrocity, as claimed, then the atrocity did not begin in April 1975. It simply entered its 6th year. William Shawcross. But the truth plainly would not have served the purposes of this exercise. Perhaps there was some other example of this fervent and frequent expression of skepticism that silenced the West. Shawcross is wise to avoid examples, because as he knows well, his primary source, Panchaud, went out of his way to praise Chomsky for the responsible attitude and precision of thought shown in what he had written on Cambodia, referring to our 1977 review of his book cited earlier and unpublished correspondence he had seen, which exhausts anything relevant that appears during the DK period. So Shawcross would have us believe that a single 1977 article in The Nation silenced the West, an article in which, furthermore, we praised the book written by his primary source, Panchaud, as serious and worth reading, with its grisly account of what refugees have reported to him about the barbarity of their treatment at the hands of the Khmer Rouge, and stated that we are in no position to draw any conclusion about the actual extent of the atrocities in conformity to State Department specialists and other informed sources at the time. To be clear, in our one article to which Panchaud alludes, we did express some skepticism, not only about claims that had already been withdrawn as fabrications, but also about others that remained to be assessed. Thus, in reviewing Panchaud, we expressed skepticism about his estimate of casualties caused by American bombing, which appeared to us excessive and possibly based on misinterpretation of figures he cited. And we raised questions about some of the quotes attributed to the Khmer Rouge on which he, and later others, crucially relied, but which he had presented in very different forms on different occasions, and which he later conceded to have no basis whatsoever. It is noteworthy that our skepticism about charges against the United States, although based merely on suspicion, has elicited no comment, while our skepticism about charges against the Khmer Rouge, which was based on textual evidence and, as it later turned out, was much understated, has aroused great fury in what Vickery describes as incompetent, even dishonest, and often scurrilous commentary. The differential reaction is easily explained. It is taken for granted that U.S. actions must be recounted with scrupulous care and in nuanced manner, so our insistence on this is simply what is to be expected, meriting no comment. We agree. In contrast, the acts of official enemies merit no such scruples, and it is an unforgivable crime to question propaganda exercises undertaken in the service of power. Notice that even had the skepticism of the Western left, to which Shawcross alludes, existed to any significant degree, the idea that this could have the consequences he describes, coming from people systematically barred from the media and mainstream discussion, is a construction of such audacity that one must admire its creator. Shawcross argues further that this alleged left-wing skepticism not only silenced Western media and governments, but also prevented any meaningful Western response to Khmer Rouge atrocities. This thesis is too ludicrous to merit comment, and we can assess Shawcross's seriousness in advancing it by turning to his own proposals at the time as to what could be done, recalling that he had easy access to the mainstream media throughout. We find not a word suggesting what might be done, for the simple reason that neither he nor anyone else could think of anything useful. The situation was of course quite different during Phase 1 of the genocide, or with regard to Timor during Phase 2 and since, and in innumerable other cases where Shawcross's charge would indeed be valid. We learn a good deal about Holocaust and the modern conscience by observing this exercise and the reaction it elicited. Shawcross attributes this left-wing skepticism, which had such awesome consequences because of the influence of the left on Western institutions, in part to Vietnamese propaganda. Vietnam's spokesman had undercut the refugee stories about Khmer Rouge conduct, he writes, thus adding to disbelief in them, particularly on the Western left, which naturally takes its cues from Hanoi and closely parrots its doctrines according to approved dogma, although it is interesting that Shawcross also insinuates that the influence of Hanoi extended beyond its acolytes. And why not? If we have reached the point of claiming that the Western left silenced the media and governments, why not proceed to maintain that even outside these dangerous circles, Vietnamese propaganda is a powerful force in shaping opinion? Naturally, Shawcross does not make even a pretense of providing any evidence for what he knows perfectly well to be the sheerest fantasy from beginning to end. We may place this outlandish explanation of the silence of the West alongside the similar claims that State Department communists lost China, that the media are threatening the foundations of democracy with their adversarial stance, etc. The reaction, however, was not ridicule, but rather great enthusiasm. To cite just one typical example, David Hawke observes that Shawcross attributes the world's indifference to the influence of anti-war academics and activists on the American left who obfuscated Khmer Rouge behavior, denigrated the post-1975 refugee reports, and denounced the journalists who got those stories. He accepts this thesis as valid, but cites no evidence either for the indifference to the atrocities, which were being denounced worldwide as genocidal, or for the alleged behavior of the American left, nor does he explain the mechanisms whereby this behavior, had it existed, could have controlled the mainstream media or even marginally influenced them. Convenient mythologies require neither evidence nor logic, nor do they require any attention to Hawke's own performance at the time as an Amnesty International official and specialist on Southeast Asia. The AI annual report for 1977 noted that the number of alleged executions in Cambodia was fewer than during the preceding year, and while it summarizes a number of reports of executions and disappearances, its account is restrained. The 1978 annual report, while stronger in its allegations of violence, pointed out that refugee reports, on which it was necessary to rely heavily, are often imprecise or conflicting, thus leaving AI and Hawke in the Shawcross-Hawke category of those who denigrated the post-1975 refugee reports. It is so easy to moralize in retrospect. Shawcross develops this thesis further in interesting ways. To show that Western commentators refused to recognize that the Khmer Rouge was a Marxist-Leninist government, he states that British journalist John Pilger constantly compared the Khmer Rouge with the Nazis, suppressing the fact that he explicitly compared their actions with Stalin's terror, as Pilger noted in a response to one of the many reviews that repeated Shawcross's inventions. Shawcross claims further that the present authors were to believe for years that the refugees were unreliable, that the CIA was cooking up a bloodbath to say, "We told you so." He cites our one article, The Nation, 1977, in which there is no hint of any such thesis, as there is none elsewhere. In that article we were clear and explicit, as also subsequently that refugee reports left no doubt that the record of Khmer Rouge atrocities was substantial and often gruesome, and that in the case of Cambodia there is no difficulty in documenting major atrocities and oppression primarily from the reports of refugees. To support his contention with regard to our alleged denial of the reliability of refugees, Shawcross cites our comment on the need to exercise care in analyzing refugee reports, carefully suppressing the fact that we were quoting Panchaud, his primary source, and that the comment he cites is a familiar truism. His reference to the CIA cooking up a bloodbath is pure fantasy, although we might add that by the time he wrote, although after our book appeared, Michael Vickery did present evidence that the Baron Paul Reader's Digest account was in part a CIA disinformation effort. Shawcross states further his view, contrary to Chomsky and Herman, that the U.S. government was remarkably inactive in anti-Khmer Rouge propaganda. We proposed no U.S. government role whatsoever in orchestrating the deceit we documented by William Shawcross and others, and in fact endorsed State Department reports as the most plausible then available, and so on throughout. But Shawcross and others who are deeply offended by our challenge to the right to lie in the service of one's favored state understand very well that charges against dissident opinion require no evidence, and that ideological useful accusations will stand merely on the basis of endless repetition, however ludicrous they may be. Even the claim that the American left silenced the entire West during the Pol Pot period. Shawcross's charges against other enemies follow the same pattern, another factor, presumably, in the appeal of his message. Thus, in pursuit of his fashionable quest to attribute primary responsibility for the continuing tragedy of Cambodia to Vietnam, not to those who were responsible for Phase 1 of the genocide with their careless policies and who are now supporting Pol Pot, Shawcross rationalizes the current support for Pol Pot as a natural response to Vietnamese actions. Given Hanoi's invasion of Cambodia and subsequent conduct, he explains, China and the ASEAN countries of Southeast Asia, not to speak of their Western partners, were bound to seek to apply all possible forms of pressure upon Hanoi to renounce its intentions, and the Vietnamese could have predicted that such pressures would include support for the Khmer Rouge. Thus, the Vietnamese are to blame if China and the United States support Pol Pot, along with such dedicated advocates of human rights and strict reliance on peaceful means as Indonesia and Thailand. Such analysis is, however, not extended to the Vietnamese, who are always carrying out cold-blooded strategies in a world without threats from China or the United States, threats that might allow us to predict and thus implicitly exonerate these strategies. According to Shawcross, Vietnam's conduct since its invasion of Cambodia rarely suggested that it wished to see a compromise in which the Khmer Rouge were removed as a viable force in Cambodia, which was what the ASEAN countries and their Western partners insisted was their aim. It was impossible to predict whether any such suggestion from Hanoi would have been accepted by the Chinese or the ASEAN countries, but the point is that it was never made, Shawcross asserts without qualification. Hanoi has repeatedly offered to withdraw in favor of an indigenous regime, the only condition being the exclusion of the top Khmer Rouge leadership. Whether these offers were serious or not, we do not know, as they have been dismissed by the Deng-Reagan alliance and, with more vacillation, the ASEAN countries. These rejections, in favor of continued support for Pol Pot, have been featured in the media, which would hardly surprise a rational observer. But these facts are hardly supportive of Shawcross's analysis, to say the least. In a further effort to cast the blame on the approved enemy, Shawcross asserts that the Vietnamese placed more confidence in the tortures than in their victims, that many of those people were actually being promoted by the new order into positions of new authority over them. As his sole evidence, he cites a story told twice in his book about an old woman he met in Cambodia who described with great passion how the Khmer Rouge murderer of her son was living unpunished in the neighboring village. He repeated the same story in the New York Review of Books, eliciting a letter from Ben Kiernan, who accompanied him when this alleged incident took place and was his interpreter. Kiernan cited the tape of the woman's statement, which reveals that she had simply said that the murderer had run away to a neighboring district, suggesting, as Kiernan notes, that he feared punishment, but not that he had been promoted to new authority. Confronted with this evidence, Shawcross maintained his position while retreating to the claim that some officials he met seemed rather unpleasant, which suffices to prove the point, according to his logic. These examples are quite typical. 6.2.9 Summary. Summarizing, prior to the decade of the genocide, media treatment of Cambodia was as predicted by the propaganda model, and the same is true quite dramatically during the two phases of this terrible period and since. During Phase 1, refugee testimony was considered uninteresting, and little is known today apart from the fact